Charles had everything a man could dream of, yet inside his heart there was a loneliness no fortune could cure. His mansion stood tall on the edge of the city, a house of marble floors, golden chandeliers, and wide gardens that stretched farther than the eye could see. To anyone passing by, it was the picture of success. But behind those tall windows, Charles carried a pain that money had never been able to erase. His twin boys, Ethan and Evan, had been born blind. From the moment they came into this world, doctors whispered words he never wanted to hear. There was no treatment, no miracle cure that could restore their sight. Charles, a man who built empires, found himself powerless before life's harsh reality. The twins grew up surrounded by luxury. Their rooms were filled with the latest toys, soft carpets, and the best tutors money could buy. But no matter how much he tried, the one thing Charles could not give them was the gift of sight. He would walk into their room late at night, finding them sitting quietly, their small hands tracing the edges of their toys without much excitement. They did not know the colors of the sky, the shine of the sun, or the smile on their father's face. Charles would sometimes sit with them, describing the world outside in careful detail, but the boys always listened in silence, their expressions calm yet distant, as if they had learned to accept a world they could not see. It was this silence that broke Charles more than anything else. He was a man who thrived on energy in life, yet his home felt like a place without laughter. Neighbors admired him. Business partners respected him. But when he was alone, he wondered if he had failed his children. He often replayed memories of when they were babies, when he first held them in his arms and promised he would give them everything. Years later, he realized that promise felt empty because the most important thing they needed was beyond his reach. Doctors had traveled from abroad to see the twins. Specialists in expensive suits came and went, each one examining the boys with their instruments before shaking their heads. Some offered small hopes, treatments that might improve their awareness, but none could promise true sight. Charles paid every bill, funded every possibility, and still the answer was the same. In the quiet moments, he would sit at his desk, staring at the paperwork that measured his empire's worth, and think to himself that all the zeros in his bank account meant nothing compared to the joy of watching his sons run freely through the garden without guidance. The staff in the mansion treated the boys politely but distantly. Most were used to working for a wealthy man, and though they showed respect, their care often lacked warmth. Tutors came in, taught lessons in soft voices, then left without much affection. Caretakers were hired again and again, but none stayed long. Some grew frustrated, others too strict, and a few simply treated the boys as fragile burdens. Charles could sense the boys withdrawing deeper into themselves with each change. They rarely spoke at the dinner table, their small hands fumbling with forks while he watched helplessly. Their world had become a quiet circle. Eat, rest, lessons, repeat. At times, Charles tried to fill the emptiness with gifts. He bought musical instruments, games that made sounds, and even a small indoor playground built especially for them. But more often than not, those expensive things sat untouched. The boys longed for something that money could not purchase, though they themselves could not yet name it. Sometimes, late at night, Charles would hear faint whispers from their room. Ethan softly asking Evan what colors might look like, Evan wondering aloud if the sun felt as bright as people described. Charles would stand outside the door, unable to step in, because his heart ached too much to answer. Friends advised him to stay strong, reminding him that his children were still healthy in other ways. They had good food, good shelter, the best medical support. But Charles knew better. He knew what they were missing: the joy of childhood, the laughter discovering new things, the spark in the eyes of children seeing wonders for the first time. His twins had been robbed of that simple magic, and he felt powerless to restore it. Even though he tried to tell himself he was doing enough, in the quiet of his nights, he admitted he was failing them. The mansion became a place of routine, where every day blended into the next. Mornings with breakfast prepared by staff, afternoons with tutors, evenings with silence. The boys rarely smiled, and when they did, it was faint, as though they were forcing happiness to please their father. Charles began to fear that this would be their life forever, a future of shadows, without joy or laughter echoing through the halls. One afternoon, Charles watched as the twins sat in the garden. The sun was shining. The flowers were blooming, but Ethan and Evan sat quietly, their heads slightly tilted as if listening for something. They couldn't see the colors bursting around them, but Charles wished desperately that they could. His throat tightened as he realized the garden he had built, the one filled with fountains and rare plants, meant nothing to them. They only heard the water trickle, smelled the faint sweetness of roses, but the sight of beauty was forever beyond them. That day, Charles walked back inside with a heaviness that seemed impossible to shake. The truth was, Charles had begun to lose hope. He had searched the world for answers, but all he had found was disappointment. He sometimes thought his children would never experience joy, and in his darker moments, he questioned if he himself would ever hear them laugh freely. Yet, in the depths of his despair, life was quietly preparing to send someone who would change everything. Someone who would walk through the doors of that mansion, not carrying promises of medicine or miracles, but carrying something far greater, compassion, patience, and love. Someone who would not see Ethan and Evan as broken, but as boys waiting to be understood. Charles didn't know it yet, but the silence that filled his house was about to be broken. The emptiness he carried was about to be filled, not by wealth or science, but by the simplest power of human kindness. And though the twins could not see, the world was about to open before them in ways no one could have imagined. Angela arrived at the mansion on a quiet morning, when the air felt heavy with the same silence that had wrapped itself around the house for years. She was not like the others who had come before her, carrying polished resumes and carefully rehearsed words. She walked in with a calm smile, her step steady and her eyes kind. Charles had hired her after the last caretaker left without warning, and truth be told, he had little faith left. To him, she was just another in a long line of people who would come, work for a short time, and then leave. But there was something different about Angela, something gentle in the way she greeted the staff, the way she looked around not with judgment but with warmth, as if she was already making space in her heart for the people who lived there. On her first day, she was taken on a tour of the mansion. The grandeur of the place didn't intimidate her. The marble floors, the tall windows, the golden frames on the walls. None of it distracted her from noticing what mattered most. She saw the boys. Ethan and Evan were sitting in the corner of the living room, small and quiet, their heads tilted downward. Their father had told her they didn't talk much, but what she noticed was not a lack of words. It was a lack of spark. She saw children who had learned to shrink into themselves because no one had bothered to reach them. Her heart softened instantly. Angela didn't start her work by polishing silverware or scrubbing the floors. Instead, she walked over to where the twins sat. She crouched down so she was at their level and said hello in a voice that sounded like a melody, soft and warm. The boys turned their faces toward her, cautious but curious. No one had ever spoken to them like that before. Not as heirs, not as fragile children, but as boys who deserved attention. She introduced herself and asked their names, even though she already knew them. She wanted them to hear her interest, to feel it in the way she spoke. When they answered softly, she smiled wide, as though their voices were the most important sound in the world. That small moment broke something inside the mansion. For years, the staff had kept their distance, doing their jobs without stepping into the children's world. But Angela leaned in, daring to enter it. She asked Ethan if he liked stories, and he nodded slightly. She asked Evan if he liked to laugh, and he gave a tiny smile. She clapped her hands gently and told them she would share a story that very evening, one they had never heard before. The boys sat up straighter. Something inside them shifted, and Charles, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, felt a flicker of surprise. He hadn't seen that kind of response in years. As the day went on, Angela completed her duties, but her heart and mind stayed with the twins. At lunch, instead of leaving them to eat in silence, she described the meal to them. She told them how the bread was warm, how the butter melted like sunshine, how the soup smelled like herbs on a summer afternoon. The boys giggled when she compared the carrots to little orange soldiers marching in a bowl. They had never been spoken to in such colorful ways before, and though they couldn't see the food, she painted pictures with her words that made them feel included in the experience of it. That night, true to her promise, Angela told them a story. She sat by their bedsides and began weaving a tale from her own childhood. She spoke of fireflies that lit up the night like tiny stars, of summer evenings filled with laughter, of the sound of rain on tin roofs. Ethan listened with wide eyes, his head tilted as if he could see the images she painted. Evan laughed when she described her little brother slipping in the mud while chasing those fireflies. The boys clung to her words, and when she finished, they begged her to tell another. She smiled and said tomorrow. That single word, tomorrow, gave them something to look forward to, something they hadn't felt in years. Charles overheard from the hallway, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't explain. He had hired countless people, spent fortunes on specialists, but never had he seen anyone reach his sons like this. He had expected Angela to do her duties and nothing more, but what she gave them was beyond her job description. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed, grateful for the gift she was giving, ashamed that he had not been able to give it himself. In the following days, Angela's bond with the twins grew stronger. She learned their routines, but more importantly, she learned their personalities. Ethan was thoughtful, often a quieter one, but when he spoke, his words carried depth. Evan, on the other hand, had a playful streak buried under his silence, and Angela gently coaxed it out with silly jokes and playful games. She never treated them as fragile. She treated them as capable boys who just needed someone to believe in them. One afternoon, she brought a small drum into their room. She placed it in front of Ethan and guided his hands to the surface. The boy tapped it lightly, then again, and soon a rhythm formed. His face lit up with excitement as he realized he could create music. Evan clapped along, and before long, the room was filled with sound. The laughter that followed was bright and pure, echoing to the mansion like sunlight breaking through clouds. Charles, walking through the hallway, froze when he heard it. His hands trembled as he leaned against the wall. He couldn't remember the last time his house had sounded like that. Angela's presence began to change the atmosphere of the entire mansion. The staff noticed it too. Where once the boys were ignored, now they were at the center of attention. People smiled more, conversations grew warmer, and a sense of life returned to house. It wasn't just the twins who were changing. It was everyone around them. Angela's kindness was contagious, and her belief that the boys deserved more than pity spread through the walls like light. At night, Charles found himself thinking about her. She wasn't a doctor, wasn't trained in any advanced science, yet she had managed to do what no one else had done. She gave his children joy. He began to wonder if perhaps he had been searching in the wrong places all along. Maybe it wasn't medicine or wealth that could heal his sons' hearts, but something simpler: human connection, love, and patience. The twins, who once sat quietly in corners, now waited eagerly each morning for Angela to arrive. They reached for her hand when she walked in, laughed at her jokes, and listened intently to every story she told. They no longer lived in the shadow of silence. They were beginning to discover the sound of happiness. For the first time in years, the mansion was not just a house filled with wealth. It was becoming a home, and though none of them could see it clearly yet, this was only the beginning. The journey that started with a simple smile and a warm hello was about to transform their lives in ways even Charles could not imagine. Angela had stepped into their world not to fix what was broken, but to show them what was still whole. And that small act of love was enough to change everything. Angela had been in the mansion only a short while, yet it felt as if she had always belonged there. The twins, once quiet and withdrawn, now waited eagerly for the sound of her footsteps in the morning. As soon as she entered their room, their faces lit up with smiles that once seemed impossible. She had found her own way of reaching them, not through pity or professional techniques, but through warmth, patience, and love. What she gave them was not material. It was human connection, something their lives had been missing despite all the luxury around them. She began each day by sitting with them before breakfast, describing the sunlight coming into the tall windows, the rustle of trees outside, and even the songs of birds that perched in the garden. The boys, Ethan and Evan, leaned closer as if her words painted pictures they could almost see. They asked her small questions, simple but full of curiosity. What did the sky look like? Was the grass really as green as people said? Did the clouds move quickly or slowly? Angela never grew tired of answering. She explained everything in a way that made them laugh, sometimes turning descriptions into little stories. If a cloud moved across the sky, she would describe it as a giant pillow drifting on a lazy afternoon. If the wind blew, she called it the whisper of the world sharing secrets. The twins listened with joy, and for the first time, they began to feel like they were part of the world outside their silence. One afternoon, Angela sat them down on the floor with a box of old wooden blocks. She guided their hands over the shapes and encouraged them to build something, telling them it didn't have to be perfect. At first, they fumbled, unsure of themselves, but she clapped with excitement at even the smallest tower. "You did it," she said with genuine pride, and the boys giggled at her enthusiasm. Slowly, they started to build taller towers, working together, knocking them down, and laughing at the sound of blocks scattering. Their laughter filled the house, traveling down the halls, reaching Charles in his study. He stopped working when he heard it, his pen dropping from his hand. That sound was something he had longed for more than anything, and now it was back, echoing through the mansion. Angela noticed that Ethan had a deep love for music. He would tap his fingers against the table, creating small rhythms, and she encouraged it. One day she brought him a small harmonica she had owned since she was a child. Placing it gently in his hands, she told him to blow softly. At first, the sound was shaky, but soon Ethan found a simple tune. His face brightened with excitement as he realized he could make music on his own. Evan clapped along, laughing, and asked if he could try too. Before long, the two of them were taking turns, filling the room with cheerful sounds. Angela laughed with them, and Charles, listening from the doorway, felt tears sting his eyes. He had bought them expensive toys, machines, and instruments, yet it was Angela's small gift that had unlocked their joy. Even simple walks around the mansion changed with her presence. Before, the twins often stayed indoors, too hesitant to explore. Angela, however, encouraged them to feel the world with their hands and feet. She guided them into the garden, letting them touch the bark of trees, run their fingers over flower petals, and listen to the sound of water flowing from the fountain. She asked them to describe what they felt, and though their words were simple, their excitement was clear. Ethan said the bark felt strong, like it had lived for hundreds of years. Evan said the flowers smelled like happiness. Angela laughed, holding their hands, telling them they were teaching her how to see the world differently. Charles began to notice changes in himself, too. Watching Angela with the twins made him realize how much he had hidden behind his wealth. For years, he believed money could solve every problem, but he was slowly learning that love could do more than riches ever could. He started to spend more time with the boys, not just as a father providing care, but as a man learning to truly be present. He would sit with them during Angela's stories, listening with a smile, sometimes adding his own descriptions. The boys began to laugh with him, too, their relationship slowly mending through the warmth Angela had brought into the home. One evening, as the family sat together after dinner, Angela suggested playing a game with sounds. She filled small jars with different items, rice, beans, coins, and asked the twins to guess the sounds when she shook them. Ethan and Evan leaned forward, listening carefully, their faces alive with concentration. When they guessed correctly, they shouted with delight, cheering as if they had won a grand prize. Charles laughed too, joining in the fun, and for the first time, he realized the mansion was filled not with silence, but with energy and joy. Angela's gift was not in giving them sight, but in giving them vision. She made them believe they could live fully, even without seeing. She showed them how to rely on their other senses, how to embrace challenges, and most importantly, how to feel confident in themselves. The twins began to talk more, ask more questions, and even dream. Ethan said one day he wanted to play music on a big stage. Evan said he wanted to tell stories like Angela, stories that made people laugh. Their father listened with pride, realizing that his children now had hope for the future. As days turned into weeks, the boys became more independent. Angela encouraged them to try things on their own, tying their shoes, pouring a glass of water, even helping to set the table. At first, they struggled, spilling and fumbling, but she clapped and celebrated every effort. Her encouragement gave them courage, and soon they were proud of their small victories. Charles noticed how their confidence grew, and for the first time he could picture a future where his sons were not trapped by their blindness, but free to live meaningful lives. At night, before the boys went to bed, Angela always told them one last story, Sometimes it was about her childhood, sometimes about the world outside, and sometimes she created tales just for them. Stories of brave boys who could do anything they set their hearts on. Ethan and Evan listened, their eyes closed, smiling as if they could see the pictures in their minds. When they finally drifted off to sleep, the house no longer felt like a place of sorrow. It was alive, warm, and filled with love. Charles often stood by the door, watching the simple bedtime ritual with gratitude. He realized that Angela had given him something priceless. She had reminded him that what his children needed most was not perfection or cures, but love, presence, and belief. And though the twins could not see the world with their eyes, Angela had opened their hearts, and that was a vision brighter than anything else. The days had taken on a new rhythm in the mansion. What was once a place of silence and routine had now turned into a home filled with laughter, warmth, and discovery. Ethan and Evan were no longer the quiet boys sitting in the corners of their rooms. They had grown more confident, more alive, and their voices carried to the house in ways that touched everyone's hearts. Angela's presence had transformed not only the children, but the entire household. Charles, who had once felt helpless and distant, now found himself sitting closer to his children, joining in their games, and watching with pride as they continued to grow in ways he had never imagined. Though the boys could not see with their eyes, Angela had given them a different kind of vision, one that came from imagination and emotion. She encouraged them to explore the world not as something they lacked, but as something they could still embrace. When she read stories to them, she didn't just recite the words, she filled them with life. She made the heroes sound brave, the villains sound sly, and the landscapes come alive with detail. The twins leaned in close, smiling, laughing, sometimes even gasping when the story reached an exciting part. To them, her stories were like windows that opened into worlds they had never experienced, and it made them feel as though nothing was beyond their reach. One evening, Angela sat them down with sheets of paper and crayons. At first, Charles thought it was strange. How could blind children draw? But Angela told him gently to wait. She guided the boys to hold the crayons, encouraging them to let their imagination flow. "You don't need to see the lines," she whispered. "Just draw how you feel." Ethan pressed his crayon onto the paper and made wide strokes, telling her he was drawing the sound of the fountain in the garden. Evan, with a big smile, scribbled circles, explaining that it was the laughter he felt when he and his brother played the drum and harmonica together. Their drawings were not like the ones children usually make, but to Angela, they were masterpieces, expressions of their inner world. Charles stood quietly watching, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time, he realized that even though they could not see, they could still create. Music became another world of freedom for them. Ethan practiced a harmonica every day, learning how to control his breath to make soft notes or strong ones. Evan, with his natural rhythm, would tap along on the drum, and together they created simple songs. Angela would clap along, encouraging them, sometimes humming a tune that they followed. The house that had once felt so heavy was now filled with sound that came not from wealth or machines, but from the pure joy of children expressing themselves. One night, they played their little tune in the living room for Charles, and he applauded as if he were in a grand concert hall. The boys beamed with pride, and Charles told them they were his greatest musicians. His voice shook when he said it, because he realized how proud he was, not of what they lacked, but of what they had found. Angela also taught them to write using Braille. It was slow and difficult at first. The twins grew frustrated when their fingers couldn't catch the patterns right away. But Angela never let them give up. She sat beside them, patient and encouraging, celebrating every single letter they learned. Soon, the boys were able to read short sentences, then longer ones. The joy on their faces when they realized they could read on their own was indescribable. It was as though a whole new door had opened for them. Charles often watched them with tears in his eyes, thinking back to the hopelessness he had once felt. The world was no longer a dark cage for his children. It was becoming a place they could explore with confidence. The greatest change, however, was not just in their learning, but in their spirits. The twins began to dream. They started speaking about the future, something they had never done before. Ethan said he wanted to learn to play many instruments, and maybe even perform one day. Evan declared he wanted to tell stories like Angela, to create worlds that made people laugh and feel alive. Their voices carried excitement, and their father realized that hope had finally taken root in them. It was something no doctor, no treatment, no amount of money had ever given them. Charles, too, had changed. He no longer saw his children through the lens of limitation. Instead, he began to see their strength, their courage, and the unique way they experienced life. He joined Angela in celebrating their victories, no matter how small. Whether it was pouring a glass of water without spilling or learning to tie their own shoes, he clapped for them, hugged them, and reminded them that they were capable. The boys, who had once felt invisible even in their own home, now felt seen and cherished in every moment. One Sunday afternoon, Angela suggested something bold, that the family should attend a small community event in the park. Charles hesitated, worried about how the world would treat his sons. But Angela's steady confidence convinced him. When they arrived, people did stare for a moment, but the boys were too busy laughing and holding Angela's hands to notice. Angela encouraged them to join in a group song that was being performed. And to everyone's surprise, Ethan brought out his harmonica while Evan tapped on his small drum. The crowd smiled and clapped along, and soon the twins were performing in front of strangers. For Charles, watching them stand tall and unafraid, it was the most powerful sight he had ever witnessed. That night, when they returned home, the boys could not stop talking about how proud they felt. They described the cheer of the crowd, the warmth of clapping hands, and how alive they felt when they played. They said they wanted to do it again, to share their music with more people. Charles sat silently, overwhelmed by how far they had come. He thought about the years of silence and sorrow, about the fear that had kept him from letting them live freely. And then he looked at Angela, who sat quietly smiling, and realized she had given him something priceless. Hope not only for his children, but for himself. In the quiet moments after the boys went to sleep, Charles often walked through the mansion, listening to the echoes of laughter that now lingered in the halls. He understood that true wealth had nothing to do with money or possessions. His true wealth was the sound of his sons laughing, the music they played, the stories they dreamed of telling. And all of this had been unlocked because one woman had walked into their lives with love in her heart. Angela had not restored the twins' physical sight, but she had opened their inner eyes to life. She had shown them that blindness did not mean darkness. It only meant they experienced the world differently. And with love, patience, and courage, they could still see more than most people ever would. The weeks slowly turned into months, and with every passing day, Angela's presence continued to shape the lives of Ethan and Evan in ways no one had imagined. The boys were no longer the quiet shadows they had once been. Instead, they had started to bloom like flowers long hidden in the dark, but finally touched by sunlight. Angela had not only become their guide, but also their friend, their teacher, and in many ways, their second mother. Her patience and steady encouragement gave them courage to step into a world they had once feared. She began introducing small changes to their routine, things that pushed them gently out of their comfort zone. Instead of keeping them inside, she encouraged Charles to let them explore the world beyond the mansion walls. At first, he hesitated. For years, he had believed keeping them sheltered was a form of protection. He feared the world would be too harsh, that people would stare, or that the boys might get hurt. But Angela's calm confidence softened his fears. She reminded him that children, no matter their challenges, needed to feel free, needed to experience life. With her by their side, she promised they would not only be safe, but would grow stronger. The first time they stepped outside the gates of the mansion was a moment Charles would never forget. He watched as Angela held their hands, guiding them carefully down the path. The boys were nervous at first, gripping tightly as though the world outside was too big, too unpredictable. But Angela kept speaking to them softly, describing the warmth of the sun on their faces, the rustle of leaves overhead, the smell of fresh-cut grass from a neighbor's lawn. Slowly, they relaxed, their small steps growing steadier. Charles followed a few steps behind, his heart heavy with pride and emotion. For years, he had thought of their blindness as a wall that separated them from life. But in that moment, he realized it was not a wall at all. It was a challenge they could still rise above. Angela began taking them on short walks to the nearby park. At first, the boys clung to her, nervous about every sound and step. But as days passed, they started to notice the joy of the world outside. They listened to children laughing on swings, to the sound of a dog barking happily, to the rhythm of joggers' footsteps on the path. Angela encouraged them to use their senses fully. She would hand them a flower and let them feel its delicate petals, asking them to describe its texture. She guided their hands along the rough bark of a tree, showing them how every surface told its own story. Ethan said the tree felt like strength. Evan said the petals felt like a smile. Their words brought tears to Charles's eyes. One afternoon in the park, Angela sat with them on the grass and let them lie back to feel the warmth of the earth beneath them. She told them to listen closely. The boys tilted their heads, their faces calm as they absorbed the sounds around them. The chirping of birds, the laughter of children, the distant hum of cars. Angela asked them to describe what they felt, and Ethan whispered that he felt alive, like the world was singing just for him. Evan added that the ground beneath him felt like it was holding him gently. Those words struck Charles deeply. For so long, he had been afraid they would never experience life. Yet here they were, discovering it in their own way. The change in the boys began to influence Charles as well. Inspired by Angela, he started spending more time with them in the park. At first, he stood watching, his expensive suit looking out of place among the laughter of children and families. But soon he was sitting on the grass, too, guiding his son's hands along tree trunks or holding their arms as they walked across uneven paths. He learned to describe things to them the way Angela did, not with cold facts but with warmth and feeling. The boys began to respond to him differently, not just as their father who provided everything, but as someone who shared their moments. The distance that had once stood between them started to fade. Angela also pushed the boys to try new skills at home. She introduced them to Braille, patiently guiding their small fingers over the raised dots. At first, they grew frustrated, unable to grasp the meaning. But Angela never let them give up. She celebrated each small success, clapping with joy when they managed to recognize even a single word. Her enthusiasm made them believe they were achieving something extraordinary. Slowly, they began to read short sentences, and their excitement grew with every new word they conquered. Charles, watching from the side, could hardly believe his eyes. He realized his sons were not limited. They were simply waiting for the right guidance. Music continued to be another gift in their lives. Ethan grew more skilled with the harmonica, while Evan discovered he had a natural rhythm with the drum. Angela often encouraged them to play together, turning their small room into a space filled with music. One evening, they performed a little song they had created, and Charles sat in his chair with tears sliding down his face. It was not just the sound of music he heard. It was a sound of hope, the sound of children embracing life despite their challenges. He clapped loudly, cheering them on, and in that moment he knew his home had been transformed forever. The atmosphere in the mansion changed completely. Staff members who once tiptoed around the twins now smiled at them, spoke to them, and included them in conversations. The silence that had once filled the halls was gone. In its place was laughter, music, and stories. The boys, once hidden away as though they were too fragile, now moved confidently through the house, their small hands tracing walls and furniture, their voices full of curiosity and joy. Charles often wondered how such a simple change, a maid with kindness in her heart, could bring about such a transformation. One night, as Charles stood by the window looking out at the city lights, Angela came to check on the boys after they had fallen asleep. She described to Charles how they had spent the day learning new Braille words and then finished the evening with a story that made them laugh until their sides hurt. Charles listened, his heart heavy with gratitude. He told Angela that he had spent years chasing cures, solutions, and expensive answers, but in the end, it was her love and patience that had given his son something greater than sight. She smiled gently, saying she only did what anyone with a heart would do. But Charles knew better. What she had given them was extraordinary. The twins were not just living anymore. They were thriving. They had begun to dream, to hope, to believe in possibilities. And as Charles watched them grow, he understood that the future he once feared was no longer dark. It was full of light, even if his boys could not see it with their eyes. They could feel it in their hearts, and that was enough. Charles often found himself awake long after the house had grown quiet. In the past, the silence used to weigh on him, pressing down like a heavy blanket that reminded him of everything he couldn't give his children. But now, That same silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with echoes, echoes of laughter from the day, of the twins' music, of Angela's gentle voice telling stories before bedtime. He would walk through the halls at night, stopping outside his son's room, hearing the faint sound of their steady breathing. And for the first time in years, he felt peace. Angela had become more than just someone hired to help. She was the heart of the house, the reason it had been transformed. The twins adored her, looking for her the moment they woke up, holding her hand whenever they walked, sharing their dreams with her in ways they had never done before. She had shown them that blindness was not an end, but only another way of living. Charles could not stop thinking about how she had brought life back into his children, and in turn had brought life back into him. One afternoon, Charles watched in the garden as Ethan and Evan played together with Angela. She had tied bells to a ball so that they could follow the sound as it rolled. The boys laughed, chasing after it, falling, getting up again, never discouraged. Their laughter rose high into the air, carrying across the garden like music. Charles stood quietly under a tree, his arms crossed, but his eyes soft with emotion. He had once believed his sons would never know happiness, never know freedom. Yet here they were, running with wide smiles, guided not by sight but by sound and love. His heart swelled with pride. The changes in Charles were just as visible as the changes in his children. Where he had once been distant, buried in work and guilt, now he was present. He spent less time in his office and more time sitting on the floor with his sons, listening to their songs, helping them read Braille, and laughing at their little jokes. He began to see fatherhood not as a responsibility weighed down by sorrow, but as a gift. He was no longer ashamed of what his children could not do. Instead, he celebrated everything they could. Angela noticed this transformation too. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Charles sat with her in the living room. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as he admitted that he had spent years hiding from the truth. He confessed that he had been afraid to face the world with his sons, afraid of people's stares, afraid of what others might think. Angela listened patiently, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. When he finally fell silent, she told him something that stayed with him forever. Your boys don't need the world to change for them. They only need you to walk beside them with pride. Those words pierced his heart, and he knew she was right. From that day on, he vowed never to hide them again. The twins continued to grow more confident each day. They practiced their music with dedication, and Angela encouraged them to perform whenever they had the chance. Soon, they were playing small songs for visitors, who clapped and cheered. The boys glowed with pride, and Charles glowed with them. They were no longer children defined by what they lacked. They were children defined by joy, courage, and dreams. One weekend, Charles hosted a small gathering at the mansion. He invited close friends and family, people who had not seen the twins in years. When the guests arrived, many were surprised to see the boys so full of energy and laughter. Angela had prepared them to perform. And when the time came, Ethan lifted his harmonica while Evan tapped his drum. Together, they filled the room with music that carried more than sound. It carried emotion. The guests stood silently, some with tears in their eyes, as they realized they were witnessing something far greater than a performance. They were witnessing the triumph of spirit. Afterward, people came to Charles, expressing how proud he must be. For the first time, he didn't force a polite smile or hide behind formality. Instead, he spoke openly, his voice firm with pride. Yes, I am proud. My boys may not see the world the way we do, but they see it in a way that is deeper, stronger, and more beautiful than any of us. His words came from the heart, and he meant every one of them. Angela stood quietly in the corner, her eyes shining. She didn't seek attention or credit. She only wanted to see the family whole again. But Charles couldn't let the moment pass without acknowledging her. He stood in front of everyone and spoke from the depth of his soul. None of this would have been possible without Angela. She gave my children something money could never buy: joy, hope, and courage. She didn't just open their eyes to life. She opened mine too. The room fell silent, and then warm applause broke out, not just for the twins, but for the woman who had changed their lives. That night, after everyone had left, Charles sat by his son's bedsides. He touched their hands gently, whispering how proud he was, how much he loved them. The boys smiled in their sleep, and Charles felt tears roll down his cheeks. For years, he had feared his home would always be filled with emptiness. Now it was filled with love, and he knew he owed that to Angela. In the days that followed, Charles made sure Angela knew she was part of the family. He provided for her future, not as payment for her work, but as recognition for the role she had taken in their lives. Yet more than any gift or reward, what mattered most to Angela was the bond she had with Ethan and Evan. They were no longer just a responsibility. They were her boys, too. The mansion, once a place of silence and sorrow, had become a place of music, stories, and laughter. Ethan and Evan may never see the colors of the sky or the faces of those who loved them, but they had been given something far greater. They had been given the ability to see with their hearts. They could feel the world, imagine it, and live it in ways more vivid than anyone could understand. And in that, they had found a vision stronger than sight. Charles knew that his son's journey would not always be easy. There would still be challenges ahead, moments of struggle, and days when the weight of their blindness would feel heavy. But now he also knew that they were not helpless, and neither was he. Together, with Angela by their side, they would face whatever came with courage. The story of the Millionaire's twins was no longer one of sorrow. It had become a story of transformation, of hope, and of the power of love. And as Charles looked at his children, laughing freely in the garden, he realized that the world may have taken their sight, but it had not taken their vision. With hearts full of light, they had truly learned to see everything that mattered